We call the House of Conservatism to order. In this august House tonight, we will be debating the resolution, be it resolved, America should adopt an industrial policy. Speaking in support of the proposition will be the member from Cass, Oren Cass, from the Manhattan Institute.
Thank you.
Louder, please. Opposing the resolution, the Right Honorable Member from Reinsch, Richard Reinsch from Law and Liberty. The rules of the debate shall be as follows. We will have a 12-minute constructive resolution, a speech supporting the resolution, followed by a 12-minute constructive opposing speech. Then each of the members will have 6 minutes in rebuttal. There will follow floor speeches. During the floor speeches, we will call upon members of this House to alternate, speaking in support and in opposition of the resolution. Each member shall receive 2 minutes and no more to deliver a speech on one side or the other, alternating. And then we will give each member 6 minutes for summary remarks, after which there will be, or is it shall? There shall be a division of the House. We will take a vote. And being as there are members of the press, you should act as though your vote matters. Runners will count the votes, so I will ask all in favor and then all opposed. Please keep your hands held high while we make the count, and then we shall announce whether the resolution passes or fails. Any questions? Everyone understand? All right, so without further ado, I call upon the Right Honorable Member from Cass to deliver a 12-minute speech in support of the resolution, America should adopt an industrial policy.
Well, thank you very much, Yoram, for arranging this, Richard, for joining us. I should warn all of you, I have a long list of objections to the process of the vote to challenge its legitimacy if need be, but we'll cover those at the end. Resolved that America should adopt an industrial policy. I'd like to start with a quote from Michael Boskin, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under George H.W. Bush. This is perhaps an apocryphal quote, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. He was discussing the future of the American semiconductor industry, and he said, "Computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference?" My argument in its simplest form is that there's a very large difference, and our public policy should take it into account. In defense of that proposition, I'll present 3 claims, and we'll drift sort of from economics to politics. I was a political economy major in college. I explained it to my parents as political science without the reading and economics without the math, which is really the sweet spot. But I can tell them now it did turn out to be useful for something. So the economic claim that we'll start with is that market economies don't automatically deliver the proper allocation of resources at the macro level that will deliver optimal or sustainable outcomes for the economy. The second claim, which is one about public policy, is that we do have the levers at our disposal to affect that through industrial policy. And the third is that a political claim, even our fractured political system, can deliver a better outcome than the status quo. And I'll try to sort of present these in ascending levels of offense to Richard, and he can sort of choose where he wants to jump in on that. So first, economic claim, market economies are not going to give us what we want on their own. And the first thing I think we have to understand about that is that the configuration of our economy does matter. Potato chips, computer chips. The first reason it matters is that we care not only about consumption, but about production. If all we cared about for our citizens was consumption, then in fact we wouldn't have to worry about what we made in this country. We would just have to worry about giving everybody enough money and letting them buy whatever they want from wherever they want. But I don't think we are indifferent. If Richard disagrees, we can dive in further on that, but I suspect it is the view of this House that in fact work matters, that a society in which a few people in elite coastal cities earn all the money and then we redistribute it to everybody else is not an attractive one. And if so, then we're going to have to think about the composition of our economy. Second point, manufacturing matters. That when we're looking at the composition of the economy, we actually have to care about manufacturing. And when I say manufacturing, I mean broadly, not just screwing rivets on pieces of metal, but we're talking about the making of things. We're talking about agriculture, the growing of things. We're talking about resource extraction, the creation of energy. And those things matter for a large number of reasons that have nothing to do with nostalgia, that have nothing to do with clinging to certain forms of production. For one thing, they matter because they are good, productive forms of employment, particularly for men, particularly for those with less formal education. And this makes sense based on, I think, our experience in life, and it makes sense from a perspective of economic theory. People whose comparative advantage is going to be moving things in the physical world are going to benefit if there are opportunities to move things in the physical world. And indeed, we see that productivity levels, wages are much higher in those sectors than in the service sectors that men tend to move into when the productive opportunities in the manufacturing sector go away. Second, manufacturing matters to local economies, and I think the easiest way to think about this is just to imagine the factory on the hilltop in the town and ask whether we care if it shuts down and moves overseas, and how that would feel different than if we introduce automation that reduces employment within the factory. And the reality is, in formal economics, we say actually we're fairly indifferent between those two things. But to the community, we are not indifferent at all. To the community, closing the factory down and moving production away is likely to be devastating. Introducing new technology, improving the productivity of the workers in the factory, even if there are fewer workers in the factory in the long run, looks completely different. For one thing, output is likely to increase, which means total earnings of those in the factory are going to increase. If those are different, more skilled people in the factory, they have to move to the community, and we've now introduced new folks who bring significant skills and earnings. We've maintained the supply chain and the ecosystem around the factory and the jobs those provide. And we've maintained a local economy in which the service sector is going to be more productive and more attractive to work in. So local economies care that there is manufacturing there for that reason, and they also care because everybody has to make something. Every local economy has to have something it can send to the rest of the world in return for the things it wants the rest of the world to send it. And you can think about that intuitively in that sense, but then step back and ask, well, what are you going to do if you don't make anything? And think about driving around depressed areas of this country. One thing you will see the stereotypical abandoned shopping plaza, and in the middle of it, you will see the sparkling occupational therapy office. And first you will wonder, what is that doing there? But if you think hard enough about it, you will realize that that is the community's exporter. That building is exporting to taxpayers care of the people in that community who are now on disability. And you can operate a local economy that way, but I would suggest that we don't want to. Third, manufacturing matters because it is a place that generates high levels of productivity growth over time. So Obama's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Christina Romer, made an almost identical comment to Michael Boskin's. She said, consumers value haircuts as much as hair dryers. And maybe consumers do. But if you are a worker and you want to know if it's as good to be making hair dryers as cutting people's hair, you might be concerned that you can make 100 times as many hair dryers as you might have been able to a century ago, but it probably takes almost the exact same amount of time to cut someone's hair. Which means if you're going to earn more money as a hair cutter, you'd better be cutting the hair of people who are making a lot more hair dryers than they used to. And so that manufacturing component, areas of the economy that are actually likely to generate productivity growth, are critical to the trajectory of the economy over time. Finally, manufacturing matters because of the spillovers and because of entrenchment, because of the market failures and externalities associated with that kind of economic activity. So for one thing, it matters in the supply chain. When supply chains leave, when expertise leaves, the kind that you need to do manufacturing, it's very hard to get back. One of the greatest facepalm moments in modern economics is that for 30 years we were told it doesn't matter who makes what where. It doesn't matter if all the manufacturing goes to China. And now when you ask, well, why can't we make an iPhone here? The answer is, well, obviously you can't make an iPhone here. All of the expertise is in China. And you just want to sort of slam your forehead into the desk. Thank you. In hindsight, it probably mattered where we were doing it in the first place. And likewise for innovation, I want to read a quote from Andy Grove, the longtime chairman of Intel, who said, engineers are eager to solve whatever problems they encounter. If profit margin's on the problem, we go to work on margins. And each company, ruggedly individualistic, does its best to expand efficiently and improve its own profitability. However, our pursuit of individual business, which often involves transferring manufacturing and a great deal of engineering out of the country, has hindered our ability to bring innovations to scale at home. Without scaling, we don't just lose jobs, we lose our hold on new technologies. Losing the ability to scale will ultimately damage our capacity to innovate. And we see that now in Silicon Valley, which continues to crank out extraordinarily impressive laundromat apps, but seems long ago to have lost the ability, as Peter Thiel described last night, to actually make progress in the world of atoms. Now, the problem is that markets don't care about any of those things I just described. So there's nothing in the theory of free market economics, there's nothing in the Wealth of Nations that says that we will invest as much as we should in manufacturing, that manufacturing will thrive in an economy where public policy does not take it into consideration. Second point, not only should we do something about that, but we can. That industrial policy can work. And in some cases, industrial policy is as simple as funding basic research. It's not actually controversial that the government should fund basic research. I would suggest if we care about manufacturing, we should fund basic research in areas related to manufacturing, advanced materials, robotics, logistics. Those should be priorities. We should have a National Institutes of Manufacturing, just as we have a National Institutes of Health. R&D support. We can provide subsidies to help bring new technologies to market. We can have public institutions, as they do in Germany and Japan, that help to bridge the gap so that the new basic research that leads breakthroughs here leads to actual production here and doesn't simply get sent by designers somewhere else. Our education system can focus on it. We can operate a vocational system that actually puts significant money in training people to be effective manufacturing workers instead of just training them to go and work in finance and technology. And we can focus our higher ed subsidies. We could actually acknowledge that someone who studies to be an engineer is doing something more socially valuable than someone who studies to be a comparative literature major that, I don't know what a comparative literature major does, but we don't have to subsidize those kinds of education equally. We can make infrastructure investments based on our interest in manufacturing success, in our provision of energy and logistics, in ports, in roads. And we can take regulatory reform that focuses on this specifically. We can make it specifically easier to get approvals, to move through environmental red tape, if what you're doing is building up manufacturing capacity. We can have tax treatment take this into account. We should tax at a much higher level the profits of firms that are generating their profit without the use of domestic labor than those that do. We need to take trade enforcement into account. We need to recognize that in the international system, when others all are pursuing industrial policy, they need to curtail their abuses. So we need to act very strongly against countries like China that are simply stealing our manufacturing jobs. And then we also need to recognize that we would prefer people buy our goods to our assets. And it's the latter that's happening now. And we should absolutely, relatively speaking, tax the acquisition of our assets at a higher rate than we tax the acquisition of our goods, because we have a strong social preference for the production and sale of the latter. And finally, I believe in select industries we need local content requirements. We should actually value the creation of domestic supply chains in the industries that we know matter: communications, biotechnology, those related to our national industrial base. You should actually have to buy the components of those things in this country, which would create the demand to produce them in this country. Final point, politics. It is a common libertarian rejoinder to say that even if that sounds great in theory, and if Oren was czar, I'd be all in favor of it, in practice it's going to be a disaster. And I agree that in practice it will be in many respects a mess. But what it's not fair is to compare that to the ideal alternative of a free market with no intervention that everyone goes along with politically. The reality is that we are going to make political choices about these things, that we are going to adopt policies, and adopting them from a default that recognizes what has value and what we have preferences for is going to point us in a better direction than one that starts from a default of not even considering the things that matter most. Thank you very much.
The chair calls upon the right honorable member from Reinsch to deliver an opposing constructive statement not to exceed 12 minutes.
So thank you, Yoram, for the invitation.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you for the invitation to debate, to come here and speak tonight. Oren Cass, in his book, The Once and Future Worker, and a number of things he's written in here tonight, I agree with a lot of the policies that you have put forward. The rub, though, becomes, I think, your radical critique, radical in the sense of going to the root of how government should actually interact with a market capitalist economy, given that you wouldn't be about the consumer, serving the consumer, but it would, in fact, be this double relationship of supporting workers and consumers and all of the complications that introduces. Who we are as an economy profoundly shapes how we engage in commerce. Our constitutional order is broadly built on us being both Republican and commercial. The freedom to be a self-governing people also comes with the duty of protecting the public sphere from faction and organized interest profiting at the expense of the public. Publius notes in the Federalist Papers that our unequaled spirit of enterprise would lead to international trade, but that international trade would have to be protected by a strong federal union and by a navy. And that introduces the idea of a crucial exception to trading policy that Adam Smith discusses as well, that of protecting national security, which precedes opulence and can demand restrictions. However, work and its fruits are not a privilege granted by the state. We instinctively recoil as Americans at cronyism, collusion, and special deals. Can an industrial policy actually escape such cronyism, or does it not build on the already deep corruption we already have? If trade policy, like virtually any economic policy, changes focus from adhering to a general rule of serving the consumer to enforcing a multitude of rules that prop up producers, then the focus inevitably shifts to empowering concentrated economic interest at the expense of the dispersed and aggregate interest of consumers on whom the price will fall. Industrial policy advocates argue that their policies can restore manufacturing jobs. Restoring manufacturing jobs will be desirable in itself, and the problems we face, the opioid crisis, men without work, divorce, etc., will persist without this return of manufacturing jobs. But all three claims are false. A nationalist policy will just make us poorer. There are great jobs and many more jobs now than there were during the height of manufacturing employment. And the slogans of returning manufacturing jobs actually obscures the real problems many Americans face. It will also prove a further boost to the growth of government. However, this would be in keeping with what the late Stan Evans said, quote, "Many conservatives come to Washington, D.C. to drain the swamp, only to find that it's actually a nice hot tub." It is the job of consumers, though. Is it the job of consumers to keep certain workers employed? Of course not. We are all consumers. We are not all manufacturing workers. Serving the consumer as the captain of the economy is the price of entry to the dynamism of a market economy. And while that price can be steep if you fail to meet it, it is the best jobs program we have. After all, the choices of consumers actually determine for us what is in our comparative advantage and what is not. This is how millions of new jobs are created, jobs in industries that did not previously even exist. It's a crucial feature of how trade works to increase wealth. But why are we so hung up about manufacturing jobs, which are currently only 8% of employment? According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, In May of 2019, the average hourly wage for production and non-supervisory workers in manufacturing is $22.03. For production and non-supervisory workers in the private sector service industry, it's $23.11. It's higher for construction workers and for those who work in mining and extraction. And in fact, the decline of manufacturing goes back to the 1950s, and it has declined by a regular pace, 0.4% annually since 1961, regardless of other factors in the business cycle. And this experience of declining employment in our country exists throughout the West, including states that do have an industrial policy, like France, like Germany. So according to data from the St. Louis Federal Reserve, the manufacturing share, and I think this evidences we actually have a very strong manufacturing sector, the manufacturing share of nominal GDP has declined from 28% in 1953 to 12% in 2015. But manufacturing's share of real GDP hovers between 11 to 13% since the 1940s. In 2015, it was 11.7%. In real terms, growth in manufacturing has kept up with the growth in the economy over the previous 70 years. Manufacturing's roughly constant share of real GDP and total declining employment share indicate an increase in productivity of the manufacturing sector relative to the overall economy. And this is likely because of automation. In 1980, 10 man-hours to make a ton of steel. 2015, 10 man-hours. In 2015, 2 hours to make a ton of steel. But why will our nation become poorer? Even if manufacturing wages are, on average, higher than service sector wages, it does not follow that using tariffs or other interventions to create more manufacturing jobs in the United States will create jobs that pay as high as the current manufacturing wage. Why there aren't more manufacturing jobs in the United States that use human labor is because it's a less efficient use here of whatever resources and labor we have that would be diverted into that line of work. The existing manufacturing jobs we have in this country pay the wages that as high as they are because these jobs are worth using relatively high-skilled American workers to perform, while manufacturing jobs in other countries are jobs worth using for their performance, the workers in those other countries. Using tariffs and other interventions to bring back manufacturing jobs from, say, China or Mexico will be to use these tools of government to bring jobs here that aren't as efficiently performed here as they are in other countries and aren't as efficiently performed here as are those manufacturing jobs that are here naturally, that is, without the assistance of tariffs and other interventions. But what have been the results of the Trump tariffs? Is it actually easier now to impose tariffs than it was in the 1980s, the 1930s, the 1820s? It's actually worse. Over a third to a half of all imports, I've seen data on both, serve as inputs in domestic production. 55% of the final cost of Chinese imported goods is American content. The steel tariffs do well if you work in the steel industry, for 140,000 Americans. The 2 million Americans who work with a steel as an input are actually now paying higher prices, which they will pass on. But what about China shock? That refers to the 2013 paper. The authors now go by the acronym ADH because it's been so influential. David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson. Imports from China, they argued, resulted in a 21% decline in manufacturing employment from 1999 to 2011, a loss of 2.4 net million jobs, or 15,385 jobs per month, primarily in low-skill manufacturing, furniture, and apparel. Now, the difficulty of losing a job, I do not dismiss that, but I do think we're risking an economistic or materialistic explanation if we attribute male unemployment, deaths of despair, lower marriage rates, divorce, opioid use solely to China joining the WTO. Most of the items I mentioned precede this 2001, precede that year by decades. Decreasing male workforce participation begins long before 2001 and roughly coincides with the retreat from marriage in our culture and the rise of President Johnson's Great Society programs. Family breakdown starts its dismal turn around 1960, deaths of despair rise after 1998, but by that point, the 20th percentile of male pay had been rising for 5 years. And deaths of despair obviously continue today and affect groups much more broadly than just white males without any post-high school education or training. Yet the economy continues to grow. Male pay at the 20th percentile is 19% higher than 1993. So on some of these things, like the opioid use, perhaps we should look to prescription drug practices and the lethality of heroin and fentanyl, drugs with greatly increased usage rates. So let's put China shock job losses in perspective. 6 million net job losses were created. 6 million net jobs were created during this period. And amidst the decline that has apparently struck our economy because of free trade, consider the following. US manufacturing output is 45% higher now than it was when NAFTA took effect, and it's almost returned to its peak in 2007 before the Great Recession. Industrial capacity is 66% greater now than when NAFTA was launched. It's 15% higher now than when China joined the WTO. Consider the Industrial Production Index, which tracks the output of manufacturing, mining, electric, and gas utilities. Today, this output is at a record high. US exports today are 200% higher than they were when NAFTA commenced, and they are 85% higher than when China joined the WTO. From what do we need protecting? What about trade deficits? We've run trade deficits for over 40 years, yet civilian sector employment from 1979 to now has grown from 99 million to over 150 million. There's no connection between trade deficits and the inability to create new jobs. Those facts alone should give pause to anyone who thinks our trade policies have diminished our economy. Thank you.
Mr. Cass, the chair calls upon you to deliver a 6-minute rebuttal.
All right. Well, thank you. That was a lot of statistics, which I will attempt to rebut comprehensively. I think the place to start, just within the realm of manufacturing, is to recognize that we're talking about declines in employment. Throughout most of the period where manufacturing output was rising, manufacturing employment didn't decline. Now, why was that? That was because in addition to productivity gains, automation, technology, we also grew output. Now, output has continued to grow somewhat, but it's grown much, much slower. If you compare the period from 1947 to 1972, we gained roughly 3.4% per year in manufacturing productivity growth, but output went up by 4.2%. We added millions of manufacturing jobs. What happened since 2000 is not automation. We actually grew productivity less quickly between 2000 and 2018, but output growth was only 1.3% per year. And as a result, we lost millions of jobs. So it is the loss in output growth that has driven the decline in employment. And in fact, but for that loss, we would employ as many people in manufacturing as we ever have, 5 or 6 million more than we do today. Now, you can see that also by just looking at other developed countries. Germany employed 23% of German output is in manufacturing, compared to 12% in the US. It's 19% in Japan, it's 18% in Switzerland. Those workers actually earn significantly more in manufacturing. It's about $35 an hour in the US, $47 an hour in Germany, $60 an hour in Switzerland. So there's nothing inherent in being a developed economy that says you shouldn't have a robust manufacturing sector. It's true when you try to look, well, which exact jobs did we lose in the 2000s? I think the auto work is the best available. But the counterfactual isn't just what if we hadn't let China into WTO. The counterfactual is what if we'd actually had an industrial policy? What if we hadn't said potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? What if we were the world's leading producer of semiconductors today, instead of other also developed economies, but just ones in Asia that had industrial policies and therefore attracted the production? I think deaths of despair is a concern, but I think we should look a lot more broadly. So when we talk about the loss of 6 million manufacturing jobs, yes, it's true the economy continues to grow. Economic growth is lovely. That has not translated into rising well-being for the median worker, and particularly the worker without a college degree who would have relied upon this kind of work. So economy-wide, what do we see? We see slowing productivity growth in manufacturing and overall. We see slow to non-existent wage growth. We see the decline in manufacturing employment. A male with a high school degree in 1970 could have supported a family of 4 at more than twice the poverty line. In 2016, he's only about 35% above it. That's the difference between the $33,000 a year the median high school grad earns and $55,000 a year if he'd kept pace with the trends in the broader economy. Those are the kinds of gaps we're talking about. Now, is it true that the US just can't produce things efficiently here? I suppose it's possible. It would be surprising. It would go against every theory of comparative advantage I'm aware of. In fact, it's not just that the US has a trade deficit overall. We actually run a trade deficit in advanced technology with China. We run a trade deficit in biotechnology. We run a trade deficit in electronics. We run a trade deficit in exactly the things we were supposed to run surpluses in, and we run surpluses in things like soybeans and seeds. Now, is that the function of a free market working well, or is it the function of everyone else pursuing aggressive industrial policy in the interests of their workers while we keep our hands tied behind our back? I think it's obviously the latter. And I think that's where ultimately the libertarian rhetoric falls most flat. You can have free trade, or you can have free markets, but you can't actually have both. To take the exact same dogma that said we had to open up, get rid of all the constraints, let the wild distortions that the Chinese introduce into their own economy, let that come into our economy, and then turn around and say, but those same dogmas dictate that we cannot do anything about it because efficiency shall reign, is not just incoherent, I would argue it's immoral. And the effect on our workers has been to say, well, we don't care that you can't compete on a level playing field because we believe in not doing anything. And we believe in not doing anything so strongly that we are both going to welcome in the distortions and then allow those distortions to slowly hollow out the economy. Now, I didn't propose tariffs, which was the only policy I heard Richard addressing. And so I'll run briefly back through the kinds of policies I am talking about. And certainly none are perfect, but one thing you'll notice is they're mostly areas where we already have policy. So this isn't the question of whether we're going to open the door to legislation or not. The question is whether we're going to take these concerns into account when we do legislate, when we do regulate. When we spend money on basic R&D, should we consider that manufacturing matters to so many workers? I think we should. When we consider where to invest in education in our economy, should we consider what kinds of education are going to generate the best employment in the industries where we most need to thrive? I think we should. When we consider where to make infrastructure investments, where we consider where to deregulate, are these things we should think about? I think so. And when we consider whether to do anything about other countries that are flaunting the rules of the free trade system and causing these impacts in our economy, I think obviously the answer is yes. Those are cognizable concerns that do indeed hurt us. And I think it's incumbent on us to take them into account and try to act in response. Thank you.
Mr. Reinsch, a rebuttal, not to exceed 6 minutes.
Okay, so thinking about the output growth question, it's interesting. A statistic started to be kept in 1997. Real output growth on a value-added basis, which would be total production minus intermediate inputs. That's up 40% since 1997. Manufacturing output in this country, as it did in virtually every Western country from 2007 to 2009, declined greatly. In this country, it declined by 18%. Overall, though, total value of products manufactured in this country since 1974, which is the year we're usually told manufacturing began to decline, has more than doubled. It's grown by something like 180% to 2015. Our manufacturing output per capita is tripled that of China's. It's $6,700. Theirs is $2,200. We are an incredibly productive, we're one of the most productive per capita economies in the world, $70 per hour work. Therefore, if you add $1 hour of productivity to our economy, that looks very different from $1 being added to China's. And moreover, we had these output increases in manufacturing, but total employment declined. Total employment declined from 2001 to 2007, yet the output and productivity did go up. Now, Oren makes a lot about what it didn't increase the way it should, or it didn't increase the way it did in the past. I don't know what that means. I don't know what there exists in economic logic that would suggest it should grow at the rate it did in the 60s or the 50s or the 70s. This is a dynamic economy. Things change. Moreover, where are consumers putting their dollars? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that as economies grow, as wages and income grow, they actually want to buy more of services, not the same in durable goods. That obviously will affect output. The declines in employment and manufacturing, there's obviously jobs being created in other sectors of the economy. The service sector is one. I don't know, I'm not convinced that this is some sort of a net loss. In fact, we run a service sector surplus, a service account surplus. We run a capital account surplus. Why is that? Why do we have a trade deficit? Another reason why, right? We're the world's global reserve currency. Foreign investors want to hold dollar-denominated certificates. It's an unavoidable feature of the international economy, is our status with the dollar. American equity markets are incredibly encouraging and markets people want to invest in and be a part of for obvious reasons. The debt, foreign buyers buying into our debt, that's not caused by trade. That's caused by us and the big lie in our politics that we want low taxes and a lot of government spending. That suggests we can't control our appetites. That needs to be changed. If you're worried about this, not trade. If you were to try and limit that, what would happen? If you were to try and tell foreign buyers what they could do with their dollars, don't buy American debt, I guess interest rates skyrocket, and I guess the price of imports would go up. We produce things very efficiently here. I would leave it to comparative advantage, except for things like national security, or where we have evidence, as Adam Smith discussed, where we have evidence that economies are not open to us and they're taking advantage of our situation. That might become appropriate for retaliatory measures. I understand that. Another things, I actually agree with Cass on the education, higher education. China with regard to national security and how that would affect, say, the 5G technology rollout, which as I'm reading what Huawei is doing is concerning because it definitely affects military technology. So maybe that is an area where we have to think about a role for the federal government being involved. My understanding, too, is the government has already bungled 5G development in this country through the way it's handled spectrum. What if we had an industrial policy? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that one of the most, some of the most protected industries in this country, going back for decades, steel, apparel, textiles, particularly in the Reagan administration, that none of this worked. In fact, the CBO did a look back at Reagan protectionist measures at the end of the 80s. None of these industries were ultimately protected by an industrial policy, such as it was. And this to ask a crucial question, where's the sympathy? Where's actually doing something good for workers if you're only using the government to keep them in jobs where they're not actually going to be competitive in the long run? No country is autarkic. No country is self-sufficient. Those jobs will be lost. It's much better to rethink what you're doing. The job assistance programs we have apparently not been very effective for those displaced by trade, but a better course is going to be to help them, not their industries, and not the owners of those industries. It's the workers themselves. So I just question that there's some sort of sympathy gap here by locking people into jobs and making them really subservient to industries that themselves can no longer compete. Mentioning manufacturing employment itself, the story is really of a manufacturing industry in our country that's incredible, that does incredible things. And the future in manufacturing is going to be things like 3D printing, additive manufacturing, research and demand, conceptual thinking and planning, and using relatively high-skilled workers. That's going to be the future.
All right, at this point, I will open the floor to floor speeches, 2-minute speeches. either in support of the resolution, America should adopt an industrial policy, or in opposition. Can I have someone who will deliver a 2-minute constructive in support of the resolution? The chair calls upon the member from Lucere.
You want to use those mics, a pro and a con?
There are floor mics.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My name is James Lucere. In 1986, I entered Princeton University as a double major in electrical engineering and Japanese. That's because at the time, I thought the future of Washington's power politics would be U.S.-Japanese trade issues. As a result of that career choice, I've got to say that Jeff Bezos, my double E classmate, has become the richest man on the planet. My East Asian Studies classmate, Yoram Hazony, has risen to become Speaker of this noble House. And I am just a consulting schlub with nothing better to do on a Monday night than to be here. However, I do want to offer 3 decisive arguments. I'm going to offer 3 decisive arguments why this House should overwhelmingly support the resolution and why we do need industrial policy. Argument number 1. I'm agnostic about the future. The future is unknowable. We can't plan the future of the economy, therefore agnosticism is appropriate. Number 2, we can in fact stop doing stupid things, and that amounts to a sort of industrial policy. The U.S. corporate tax code was unchanged in its outline from 1953 after World War II until 2016. It was a horrifically stupid tax code that forced companies to export capital, to invest outside the U.S., and never to repatriate profits. At least we fixed that. Finally, though, the big issue is defensive. It's the reason why we do need an industrial policy. I actually started work as a full-time professional analyst in U.S.-Japan trade policy in the very year, at literally the same time that Michael Boskin made the silicon chips versus potato chips argument. I was a little skeptical, and then I realized that Japan, frankly, for all the crazy, silly things they did, could not fundamentally hurt the United States. They're basically a democratic country. They're half the size population-wise, half the size GDP-wise. They couldn't do much. China's got 4 times the population. They've got state-sponsored intellectual policy, intellectual property theft. They've got a thorough campaign to rip us off. Thus, we need industrial policy to defend ourselves against the Chinese. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right, can we have a speaker to deliver a 2-minute floor speech in opposition of the resolution? Does someone have his hand? Excuse me, if you're volunteering someone else, I suggest that you simply proceed to the microphone yourself. Well done, sir.
I'm a student of political theory, which means that I read books and avoid numbers at all costs. What I would propose to defend is not so much to say that the policies that Mr. Cass proposes are wrong. Many of them to me seem prudent. However, in your book you often talk, and in your American Interest essay, often talk about how we need to look at the market as a tool, that since the output isn't going too well, there must be something with the input of civil society. And obviously political economy, yes, means politics, the polis, and economy, the home, the household. It's about families, it's about communities. That's the point of it all. But markets and the free market is not just something that's a tool, it's a right. It's something which is by our God-given natural rights, something where under a few simple rules, I can trade with someone in my own town using a stable currency under the rule of law, private property, contract enforcement. These simple conditions will have larger markets extend from them in a larger extended order. We don't need to recite Hayek or anything like that. You can just probably go to Burke or de Tocqueville. My point being, I guess, is that when we have an industrial policy, and for defense reasons, perhaps you have to pick winners and losers, but as a general, we want this manufacturing base. We are saying, I guess I would wonder, is this, that seems to be going towards crossing a line that is in violation of our right to have a free market, to not have winners and losers. Now, you argue that we're already picking winners and losers. We're already deciding what the marginal tax rate should be. Well, let's end the cronyism. Maybe that should be the fight. Maybe it shouldn't be that we should pick the right winners and pick the right losers, that we should stop picking winners and losers. Thank you.
If you are trying to decide whether you have the fortitude to stand for 2 minutes by your convictions, I heartily recommend that you stand. It's good for you and it's good for all of us. Can we have a speaker in support of the resolution? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Bonnie Cavusi. I found this conference interesting so far.
Well, that's good.
You could argue that the world's superpower has to have the scientific and technological advantage over other countries. The US is currently the world's superpower, and we are also a democracy and a free country. And we are making the world safe for freedom and democracy. China is trying to develop its manufacturing and advantage and scientific and technological advantage, and they're an authoritarian country. They have concentration camps. They ran over protesters in Tiananmen Square. They have a dictator for life. Do we want them to be the next superpower? And we need to be able to make our own things in our own country to keep the world safe for freedom.
Exemplary. All right. Can we have a speaker in opposition to the resolution? Sir, right there. I feel the house warming up now.
Hello, my name is Rohan Mukherjee. I'm here as a part of the Hertog Foundation, and I'm in fact enrolled in a course right now with Professor Reinsch. So thank you very much for your contribution. So in support of my professor, in fact, as much of a meager support as I can give to his very well bolstered and statistically defended argument, I think an important thing to recognize is how the very workers that we're talking about who are being harmed by these so-called industrial policies of our competing countries are in fact being deeply benefited by the cheap goods that they're able to export to the United States. In fact, if you look at the consumers of Walmart, or the consumers who go to the Walmarts and the Costco's and the cheaper stores in this nation, right? They're the very workers in these depressed wage areas of the United States who benefit from the cheap goods that China has to ship here, from the cheaper goods that India and Bangladesh ship to the United States, and to renege on that, to disincentivize those imports from China, from India, from Bangladesh, from countries which are providing goods, that their workers are benefiting from the relatively increased wages that result from freedom of trade. Our citizens, our consumers in America are benefiting as well from now greater access to a wider basket of goods at lower prices. Thank you.
The chair wants Sam.
This was a industrial policy question. So first, a direct sort of point to the earlier point.
But you have to support the resolution, right?
Yes, this is in support of the resolution. So earlier it was claimed that since 1997 output has actually increased by a certain amount, but and you're referring to a series that begins in 97, the real value added. If you subtract semiconductors, that is flatlined. So what you're viewing is the value-added component of the semiconductor industry, which the U.S. still does have a relatively strong lock on because Silicon Valley was sort of the origin of it. But that doesn't really employ anybody. It's really the last part of precision manufacturing that we have any comparative advantage in. The broader point I want to make is you used the word natural earlier. You said this is the natural outcome. And I want to question what precisely you mean by natural. Markets are not natural. I think there is a lot of truth to Oren's sort of description of markets as a tool. The institutions, when the World Bank and Jeffrey Sachs were reforming the Eastern Bloc, they had a very similar view that, oh, this is just natural, we'll deregulate, we'll privatize, and everything will work itself out. But it turns out that markets are incredibly complex, they're embedded in institutions, and those institutions bias and orient markets to certain outcomes. So I want to directly question you on this notion of naturalness, and if, in Econ 101, we learned that, if country A trades with country B, one will make gunpowder, the other one will make butter. But the US, by pursuing that kind of Ricardian comparative advantage, we only make one thing now, which is basically the designs and schematics for what everyone else makes. And in fact, the point of industrial policy is to spur diversification. The countries that took the World Bank advice, like the Philippines or Malaysia, they're still call centers. It's China and Korea and Japan that realized we need an industrial policy to diversify our economy. And Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high, and I say we can do the same for our labor market.
All right, can we have a speech opposed to the resolution? Over there. Yes. That's you. Okay. Sir.
My name is Alan Karpian. Yes, I'm a Yoram Hazony groupie. That's why I'm here. My speech, I guess, is just really very simple. It's a question of where are mistakes made. You have industrial policy, you make the mistake, and the central government makes the mistake. It goes all through the society. Without the industrial policy, and you're letting markets work, mistakes are going to be made all over the place, but the whole society doesn't go down. Enron went down, but the rest of the society didn't. The Soviet Union made the mistakes. The whole society went. That's just my basic idea.
Okay, in the far back there. You can speak from either microphone.
So I want to illustrate this by saying, so I'm a venture capitalist and I used to work in Silicon Valley, and if you're in the peninsula, right off of Highway 101, there's an exit called Willow Road, and on Willow Road you'll find the Facebook headquarters, and at Facebook there are neuroscientists currently being paid a lot of money, quite literally, to addict our children to their applications. And not far from the Facebook headquarters, there are neuroscientists working on how to cure dementia and how to cure some of the most intractable diseases that affect our society. The people who are working at Facebook, addicting our children to their applications, make much more money than the people who are attempting to cure our society of its worst diseases. And I think this question about whether we should have an industrial policy ultimately reduces to the question of, do you think our politics should have an answer about whether it is more valuable to cure our grandchildren than to addict our children to terrible applications? And I think the answer is obviously yes.
All right, a speaker in opposition. A speaker in opposition to the resolution? Yes, sir.
My name's Kevin Kwilinski. I've spent a little over 25 years in manufacturing. I'm currently a CEO of a company with about 2,000 blue-collar workers. And my argument against is that we cannot find enough workers. Over half of our 17 factories are 10 to 20% understaffed. We need a policy, and we need to focus our efforts on changing the cultural view of working in manufacturing. We need to develop trades, and we need to get a serious track of moving people into those areas.
All right, do we have another speech? Yes, in the back there. This is in support of the resolution. Yes, thank you.
Hi there. Okay, everybody can hear me. So this is a little bit more anecdotal. I'm a history major, so I don't think in economic terms. But I'm from Texas, and I've lived 2 lives in Texas primarily. I've lived in West Texas, which is a place like Mr. Vance writes about, sort of similar to Appalachia. It's a southern cultural region, but it's been really hollowed out over the last 20 or 30 years. You go through the towns, and there's these beautiful storefronts that are empty. And you drive around West Texas, and there's a sense of loss. And there's a sense of cultural loss, and that's what I want to get to, beyond the numbers. And then I lived the second part of my life in Houston, which is touted as this great conservative success. GDP skyrocketing, right? Businesses are opening every day, people are moving there. But what they don't tell you is the traffic is some of the worst in the state, or in the country. And trash is in the streets. And immigration has made it to where, frankly, crime is going up, and there's mass immigration. It leads to the traffic. And then we turn around, we wonder, why did native Texans, for the first time in several election cycles, getting into the politics of it, vote Democratic and not Republican? Because there's been a visceral backlash to the libertarian policies that are hollowing out the culture that they grew up with, leaving them without dignity, stripping them that dignity. GDP might be going up, but the sense of loss is real. Just because someone from another country on a visa, or frankly from another state, sorry to my northern friends, but we like to say, we literally moan when the governor, he'll say, Apple's opening up a factory in Austin. We moan. We say, oh God, not more of them, because they're not for Texans. And that thing that applies to the United States as well. These jobs, even if we create these manufacturing jobs in a free market, without an industrial policy that benefits Americans first, yes, the GDP goes up, all of these statistics go up, but the sense of loss, who the profit is going to, and the cultural damage is irreparable for places like West Texas, and frankly for places like Houston as well. Thank you.
All right, this will be the final floor speech in opposition. Yes.
All right, so I am also studying as a Hertog Fellow with Dr. Reinsch. I hope this won't be taken as an admission of bias. But I'd like to highlight I'd like to highlight a final point that hasn't really been addressed. And so as we all know, foreign policy is a 2-level game, and while usually that truism is invoked to remind us of the domestic sphere, I would like to here invoke it to remind us that we are not alone, or we, I shouldn't say we, I'm not American, but America is not alone in the world, and any policy that is formed by America on the international stage will also be seen abroad. America is also not alone with China in the world, and while it may be justified and prudent to adopt a tariff-based or other industrial policy to respond specifically to the Chinese imposition of tariffs and to Chinese, as has been mentioned, domestic pressure on certain economic developments, there are other nations in the world. And America has been, for better or worse, the champion of global free markets. And these global free markets have served it rather well in most instances, if we disregard the Chinese example. And I'd caution against abandoning this global championship role, because it might come back to haunt America if other nations see America as not fair competitor, as they now see China. Thank you.
All right, this brings us to the summary portion of the debate. We will first hear a 6-minute summation from Mr. Reinsch, and then a final 6-minute summation from Mr. Cass, after which we will take a vote on the resolution.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. Anyways, I'm going to start off with the sense of loss, because I think that's a huge point that I hear made a lot. And the sense of loss, I'm not sure why it would automatically follow that intervention by government is going to bring capital to a lot of different counties other than, say, the counties that it's being invested in. The sense of loss, I'm from the South. I'm actually from a small town in Tennessee that's actually growing, putting in $400,000, $500,000 homes. That's an expensive home where I'm from, because of the growth in Nashville. Why is Nashville growing? Kind of the old-time religion of conservatism, right? No taxes, next to no taxes in Tennessee, incredibly favorable labor environment, favorable regulatory environment. I went to law school in the Research Triangle. That area of the country has been virtually transformed over the last 30 years. Some government intervention in the universities, but mostly this is a trade story. This is a story of very sound fiscal policy and regulatory policy. There's right now 6.7 million, according to the May employment report we received, 6.7 million job openings. The fear is there are only 6.4 million people who could fill them. Indianapolis, where I live now, something similar is true on a much more reduced scale. The fear is there aren't enough people to fill the jobs that are open. So sometimes I wonder the economic decline, the loss, that story, where that comes from. And I think it's something that goes, that cuts against my position in a way, and just what do you see? What do you visibly see? So you do see job loss. You don't see jobs created. This is something Frederick Bastiat, a point he made in the 18th century. You never actually see what's being generated, and you never actually see what's being lost from bad government policy. Something that Oren said in his opening statement as well. I heard a lot of, it said markets don't deliver. Markets don't deliver. Well, how do we know that? What knowledge are you bringing to bear? Or is this just a subjective imposition? If they don't deliver, and this goes to, I think, the gentleman's point about, who questioned me about natural, what is natural? If they don't deliver, or if we don't think the number of jobs in a certain sector are where they should be at the wage they should be, why do you think the administrative state of the federal government is going to deliver for you? Where is the evidence for that, given the way the administrative state functions now? This is a part of the government most of us want to get rid of or extremely curtail its powers. That logic, that thinking, problem, and the government's going to solve it. I thought we were conservatives. I think that's actually ridiculous. I want to also, just think about Mr. Vance's good point. I guess the initial thing that I thought of is, yeah, I don't really care for a lot of what Facebook does. They definitely suck me in. Twitter definitely sucks me in way too much and saps other productivity from what I want to do. I also make the decision to let them sap my productivity. And I don't like, you see young people walking around college campuses. They don't talk to one another. They just interact on the phones. Yeah, I don't like that. I'm not necessarily sure what we want the government to do there. And what you want the government to do could lead to a host of other bad consequences. On thinking about medicine, how expensive is it, again, to bring a drug to market in this country that can save people's lives? It's incredibly expensive. Why? Regulation. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which, according to Philip Hamburger, researchers and firms trying to bring drugs to market can't even really talk or interact with one another at a certain level. They actually inhibit free speech and research, something I've read of Philip's recently. Why is that? Why do we let that happen? How does that inhibit saving people's lives? I will just close with thinking, all in all, markets are full of human beings, and we're bad a lot of the times, and we make bad decisions. We have bad knowledge. We think we have more knowledge than we do, all right? But that is true for every human person. It's especially true for people with concentrated power who can impose binary outcomes on certain groups. And in particular, the effect, not of a majority, right? How does the regulatory state work? It's not a majority, right? It's a concentrated minority that can affect change. Return to something I said at the beginning. That's the danger. of not having a general rule for consumers, which will actually unlock for you where you should invest, where you should produce, where you should work, but insisting you're going to actually know where to put capital via some form of active state intervention. Where that knowledge comes from, I don't know. I don't think ultimately the evidence of the great mistake of the 20th century, which is centralization across the board in Western liberal democracies, that it actually panned out. I don't think it's there. So maybe I'll just close there with those thoughts. And I continue, though, to be amazed at just the thought that we are economically in decline. I really don't see that happening around me. Thanks.
Mr. Cass's 6-minute summation.
Well, thank you all for the excellent comment, and thank you, Richard. As you said, I think this has been an excellent discussion and an actual debate, as opposed to like, oh, well, we actually kind of agree on everything, which these turn into sometimes. I wanted to reiterate, come back to my 3 points that I started with, but I've actually added a 0 above them on my sheet, which the computer science majors will love, if there are any, which is there a problem? And this is something that has struck me ever since I published my book last year. And my editor had said, you have to write a lot more in here about how there's actually something wrong. I was like, really? Like, do we really have a lot of people out there who just think like things are going great in the American economy? And as I have learned, it turns out the answer is yes. There are a lot of people who think things are going great in the American economy. And at some level, I don't know what to tell them. At some level, I don't know how to persuade someone that the aggregate data does not tell you about the lived experience of substantial segments of our society. And that when we talk about a political problem, it doesn't mean a political problem that affects 200 million people, right? Pre-existing condition coverage is a problem in this country because there are a few 100,000 people who don't have access to it. And that makes it a real problem because those are real tragedies, because most of us know someone who might be facing that problem. And at that scale, what has happened in our economy with the loss of the kinds of good jobs that people with a high school education can get and support a family, it's fallen off a cliff in this country over the past 50 years, and it is absolutely a problem. You know, I'm struck particularly by the comment, well, now I can't find enough workers. And that's true. That is something that manufacturers are experiencing, to which I would say 2 things. First, allowing us to lose all the manufacturing jobs, destroy these communities, leave people, just whether for cultural, economic reasons, uninterested and unable to take those jobs, and then lament that they won't come back to work is hardly an argument against industrial policy. And secondly, the common response is, well, you should pay them more. And I don't actually think that's a very fair response, because the reality is you can't be competitive paying them more because you're competing in an international market where all of your competitors get the benefit of industrial policy. And so those are arguments for industrial policy. I'm not sure how that's an argument against it. Now, to return to the points that I think are key to supporting the resolution, the first is some industries have more social value than others. And what I mean by social value partly is I mean support for the social foundations of our society. Partly I mean support for the long-run economic trajectory, which sounds like an economic issue, but it's not something markets are going to consider. If you want to be invested in the markets that are good for the long-term health of the country, venture capitalists aren't going to take your meeting, not even JD. Well, he might take your meeting, but he won't invest in you. Let me at least say that. And there's also the national defense point, which I think is a little bit of a cheap way to win the argument. Hey, we'd better be able to defend ourselves. But at some point, we have to remember we'd better be able to defend ourselves. Now, can and should public policy respond? You know, I think one of, in theory, the compelling arguments would be, well, it doesn't work, right? We've tried it and it doesn't work. That's not true. The United States has never tried industrial policy. We've tried tariff protections for particular industries, but that's not something I'm advocating. And where's the evidence that it does work? Well, there's the rest of the world. There's countries like Germany and Japan that do have industrial policy, despite all the pressures of a democratic system. And as I told you, have up to double the share of output in manufacturing and substantially higher wages for their manufacturing workers. And by the way, we have China. You're not supposed to say that in a room of free marketeers, but guess who industrial policy worked really well for? It worked really well for China. And I'm not here to suggest that we copy the Chinese system, but the idea that intervention in a manufacturing sector dooms it to uncompetitiveness and declining share in global markets, I think is pretty decisively disproven at this point. And it has worked in the United States in the place where we do it. We obviously have industrial policy in our defense sector. And our defense sector has a lot of problems, but it is also by far the world's leading defense sector. It produces the highest quality stuff, and it has all of the best technology. So there, you could argue it costs too much, takes too long, but it's also produced an extraordinary amount of innovation, and we have it in healthcare. We have an NIH to fund healthcare. We have an education system that heavily subsidizes the creation of doctors. And then we have public spending on healthcare. And we have a heck of a lot of problems in our healthcare system as well. But it sure as heck has produced a lot of innovation in the healthcare sector. Unfortunately, we didn't actually address any of the policies that I described, besides to say boo tariffs. And I agree, boo tariffs. But there are an awful lot of policy areas where I think we can have confidence, both that we know what we're aiming at, if we believe there are certain sectors we care about, and we know that there are effective policy instruments that we already use in other contexts and see other nations using effectively that we can try to emulate instead of ruling out of hand. Ultimately, the political argument comes down to something I thought Richard said quite compellingly at the end there, which is I thought we were conservatives. And so I'll take my last 30 seconds to unpack that. I hope we are conservatives. And conservatives have a responsibility for making sure we're organizing society in a way that's going to benefit its members. Now, if we truly can't run public policy in a way that's going to support our own industries in a system of international trade, maybe we shouldn't have international trade. But if we're going to take the first policy step of saying, gosh, here's what our free trade system looks like, then if we really are conservatives, we'd really better be able to back that up with a view of what we're going to do in the free trade system to make sure our workers win as well. Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to divide the House, which means that we are going to vote on the resolution. I ask everyone to please stay seated. I see that you are a very, very well-heeled parliament, and you are all staying seated. That's excellent. We have runners who are going to count by show of hands. Right, so I'm going to first ask all in favor and then all opposed. Please keep your hands up until the runners have counted you. Right, all in favor of the resolution, America should adopt an industrial policy. Please raise your hands.
I don't know if they need to count all the hands. Sure. I did bring the press gallery. Oh, I've even got some votes in the press gallery. Those are the lips, though.
Please keep your hands up until the runners have counted your vote. Mr. Cialdella, we can move on. All right. All those opposed to the resolution America should adopt an industrial policy, all those opposed, please raise your hands high.
Those are the real influencers.
No, the tabulation should take place prior to the chair receiving it. lest the chair make a mistake, he not being a trained economist.
You don't need to be an economist to know. I think they can put their hands down. They've been counted, right?
Yes, everyone has been counted at this point. You can feel free to put your hands down. You can cut the tension with a knife.
I'm wishing I'd brought more students. You got to go to text voting next time. What's that?
I didn't want them pulling out their phones.
It's good point.
If this were the Israeli parliament, you'd be throwing things by now. All right, the results are in. I would like to announce that the resolution, America should adopt an industrial policy, presented to the members of the House of Conservatism, passes by a vote of 99 in favor and 51 against.
Did not get my supermajority that I wanted.
Please join me in thanking both of our speakers. This session of the House of Conservatism is closed. Please join us next year.
Thank you for asking.